Sweet. If it crashes, I'm presenting anyway, so it'll be an issue either way. So there we go. Let's try to share the screen. Share this guy. We all saying that? All good? I'm assuming so. I'm not hearing, but
yeah, it's all good.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. All
Maybe
right.
go full screen if you can.
Is that looking better? I don't know why that didn't go to full. Okay. All right, so the name of this presentation is Types on Types Towards an Informatic Theory of Organization. And, you know, all the flippancy in my little description aside, the idea here was to try to explore why type theories seem to be like coming up so much when we're talking about practical problems of contemporary politics, like why they keep coming up when we're really trying to stitch our models to contemporary reality. So just a few kind of pre-things. One, I'm going with the kind of new model of presentation, so I'm going to be speaking for about an hour, monologically just going. We'll take a break for about 5 minutes, and then we'll move into conversation. So I'm going to ask comments and questions be held till after the break. That being said, if people want to be bringing stuff up in chat, please feel free to do so and have any conversations as come up. I just won't be paying attention to it because I am going to be working to stay on track. Secondly, this is organized in a kind of way, but I strongly suspect I'll be bouncing around quite a bit. And this is an experiment in a lot of ways in terms of form for myself, trying to find a good way to present my ideas visually. And then ultimately, I'm going to be trying to put to kind of like theoretical, formal model kind of two practical political issues that I've been directly entangled with. And so in that sense, I guess there's a lot of bias in this. But the two things I'm really going to try to get into are, in the second half, I'm going to kind of go over my own kind of run-ins with the problems of the theory of imperialism and trying to understand contemporary political issues, and even the things that imperialism is supposed to be good on, like war and whatnot, like the problems of running of that theory in contemporary issues. And then in the first part, I'm finally going to take up Gabrielle's exhortation to talk about Occupy. So I'm going to try to use some of these formalisms to try to map out the experience of Occupy that we had specifically here in Eugene, Oregon. And with that, to try to understand how we kind of parlayed that into a 2.5-year-long homeless rights movement. So, all right, cool. Let's go ahead and do this. So the first slide, there's a lot of words up there, and I'm not really going to like hold to getting to know them right now. What I'm trying to map out real quick here is these are terms from a book on programming that I find really useful and kind of like non-dogmatic or non-scholastic to try to map out just some really basic taxonomic language that'll be important, I think, throughout this, which is essentially that we can have both abstract and concrete entities, and those concrete entities can be organizations and not just like physical entities. That we can put together species and genuses. These are all basic things we're used to. And specifically that when we're going to be going forward and trying to talk about types, that types have to do with a kind of taxonomic logic and all this. So we have objects and values dealing with entities, types that deal with species, and concepts that deal with genera. So we can kind of come back to these vocab as we go through the presentation. I just wanted to kind of put out there that these are kind of some terms. And so this is the actual starting point. This is a quote from a recent documentary that came out on the PCC, which is a jail left, at least a somewhat left-wing ideologically jail gang out of Sao Paulo, Brazil, that has grown to international scales and also has had a very complicated relationship with the communities out of which it's grown, as well as with the state of Sao Paulo and Brazil generally. And I thought this was a really interesting comment at the end of the documentary by a former member who's now a sports marketer, who said, the PCC will always exist because it has become an abstract thing. And I think that this sets the term really well, is that kind of coming out of Dennis's presentation over the last few weeks, we're constantly caught up in like a kind of network of patterns and all these different kind of concrete things, whether those things be physical things or the kind of like concrete abstractions that JP's paper that he recently shared with us does such a good job of mapping out. But that in the process of kind of combining and especially binding all of these patterns, there are some kinds of things, which Dennis called a colimit, which successfully bind those patterns together, and others which do not. The PCC is precisely the name for something which has successfully bound a number of patterns together, and has done so on the basis of a whole bunch of particular conditions and whatnot, and I'm not going to go into that now. But I thought it was very interesting because this was a former member and a marketer, and marketers have to do with abstractions, but this wasn't a theoretician. This was someone trying to account for their own experience and for the experience of this in terms of society. And so I thought this was a really good kind of starting point, that what we're trying to understand is how abstraction through naming is a critical part of identifying an organization and making an organization exist in the first place. So these are the kind of principles for the talk going forward. And this comes out of a kind of correlation I picked up between the work of Rosen, who works in biology and what he calls relational biology, and Lazarou, who's a kind of intellectual fellow traveler of Badu, and who's trying to develop new ways of tackling social theory in the wake of kind of the dual fall of orthodox Marxism and kind of neoliberal emptying out of classic social sciences. And just one second, got a minute. All right. And in each of the theories, both Rosen and Lazarou have like two critical steps, what I call the imputative step and the relational step. And what they're both saying is, for Rosen, these are principles of natural science, and for Lazarou, principles of social science, that before you can even begin to do science, you have to take a step where you are willing to assert, and to a certain extent wager, that something is the case about what you're studying. Namely, that when you're studying social configurations, you are assuming that people are thinking, that throughout the entire process of social interactions and whatnot, people are thinking. And the same way when you're studying physical events, no matter how random or seemingly contingent they might be, that there's always some network of what Rosen calls causal entailment behind them. But the kind of art and craft of science per se is actually in the second step, which is establishing what Rosen calls a congruence between the actual causes in nature and a specific system of what he calls inferential entailment, which is generally mathematics, right? And a good physicist will be able to kind of balance between building a mathematical model and then finding ways through experimentation to kind of stitch that model onto reality and extract results from it. In the same way, Lazarou makes the claim that even though people are thinking, but that this thought is a relation of the real. And again, I think JP's paper is a really good starting point in trying to understand what like relation of the real might mean in this context of concrete abstraction. What I'm going to focus on is Lazarou's starting point in this, which is the process of naming. The book that this comes out of is Lazarou's Anthropology of the Name. And one of his kind of main procedures there is to look at names as a way of like tracking social events, social formations, and kind of seeing the ways that people develop their own connections and thoughts about social events. And, with all that in mind, I'm going to just jump into Occupy. Sorry, there we go. So Occupy, which is about 11 years ago now, took off from Wall Street, as we all know, and spread, and came about 2 months later or 6 weeks later to Eugene here. And the camp had the same conversation that I think most of the occupies around the country did, which was a conversation of whether or not we weren't becoming too much more or less a protest camp. And there was a group of us who were involved pretty heavily in kind of like keeping the camp running day to day. Some of us were involved in the kitchen work, some of us were involved in de-escalation, some involved in the kind of like distribution of donations and tent stuff and whatnot. Basically like the logistical side of the camp that really tried to like politicize that actual process, like the camp itself. And in order to do that, we needed to have a kind of analysis that enabled us to position the camp in the larger conversation of what Occupy was trying to deal with, and at the same time kind of look at the camp as the actual site that connections were being made that was building the thing called Occupy. And in order to do that, I'll jump over here actually for a second, to map these out in terms of developing ideas coming out of Dennis's presentation. That essentially names cut in two different directions, which we can't easily assimilate one to the other. On the one hand, we move from abstractions down through an understanding of constraints. And by this, we take parts out of a whole and kind of see how those parts are constrained by wholes, and at the same time, how those parts kind of make up different aspects of a whole. Looking at this here, this had to do with a particular analysis of what was going on that was largely informed by the fact that we're here in Eugene, which is the home of the Monthly Review, and John Bellamy Foster, which has a huge emphasis on this idea from Capital, Volume 1, of the Reserve Army of Labor, which is essentially the army of unemployed people who help keep wages low and act as a threat against workers who are employed from organizing or demanding better conditions or anything else, right? That in a certain extent, that the camp, which was being easily kind of identified as a homeless camp, was actually an economic refugee camp, which simultaneously put it in part of a context of a much larger issue of refugee camps in today's world, but also specifically positioned the constraints that the camp was coming up against in terms of the very real existence of the real members of the Reserve Army of Labor, and particularly those who are kind of on the worst edge of it, the homeless population. This set the kind of terms of the actual constraints of the camp, right? We had this idea going in of this thing, the 99%, which, I mean, I think statistically it's something like 70% of the United States are wage laborers. So already like the idea of a 99% is a very problematic idea from any traditional like left perspective. And so the question is, if we start from this as a kind of abstraction and ideal, Occupy the 99%, from within the perspective of the actual given camp, how do we build out to kind of recover the 99% in fact as like an actual organization? There are a lot of attempts to kind of generalize the General Assembly, the main kind of deciding representative body of the camps. And there are all these attempts to kind of build regionals and nationals, and every single one of them quickly collapsed. And I believe that's because there wasn't real kind of traction in the scaling that went on. There wasn't a real kind of like connection between the real constraints that were coming up here and the binding, the real ways that we kind of like build something from the pieces that were actually available to us all the time, of the actual people, the actual groups, the actual kind of parts of society. Now, there was an interesting thing that came out and actually became part of our political lexicon going forward over the next few years, because we did get heavily involved in homeless rights, was this idea, this word, this name called housies. And this is what homeless people called people that lived in houses. And it became the name of the political problem of what we were actually trying to do, which was holding together a real alliance in Eugene between the people that occupied the camp, who were 90% probably actual pre-existing homeless people and 10% activists by the end of it all, and the overall kind of support for the movement that lived in their homes and came and went and whatnot, who identified with Occupy, who participated in the General Assembly, who participated online, but who, when push came to shove, weren't there when everything fell apart, which is part of the story I'll come back to in a bit. But I'm going to hang on to theory here for a second. And so I drew some diagrams here to try to flesh out, I think, the difference here, kind of geometrically. If you imagine like this big picture, like we're trying to understand something like the 99%, and then we're trying to understand within that, like something like the working class, and we're trying to understand within that, like all the people who were unemployed and directly kind of precarious. And on top of that, we're finally dealing with like a homeless population inside of that. And it's easy, well, maybe not easy, but it's a kind of intellectual operation to start from the categories of Marxism and then kind of zoom down to identify, quote, the reserve army of labor. But down here, this kind of like colimit binding operation was really like the kind of political problem as such, like the actual practical problem. And these two things, one that's kind of like zooming down, the other that's kind of connecting, are the two kind of operations that we were constantly bouncing back and forth trying to deal with. We didn't really, I don't think, understood that at the time, but I think our theory helps to kind of clarify. Now, the problem here, I think, comes in wanting to believe that this circle is like a nice, neat, easy circle, that you can kind of like take the 99%, cut it down to its various parts, quickly assemble into some kind of local representation, then come back up to the whole. But the problem with that, according to Rosen, is that these two different directions, limits on the one hand and colimits on the other, actually have very different structural properties. He defines the two following, I mean, this is him just following standard category logic. Let's say we take some S, some object that we're trying to understand. In this case, we have some abstract thing called Occupy, called the 99%. Now, limits project out of the thing that they're trying to understand onto quotients or parts. You can do that with anything. You can take anything and decompose it down to its parts. The problem is that those parts are completely kind of like defined. He uses the term coordinates, kind of defined by the whole, right? So in a certain kind of sense, if what we're dealing with in terms of radical politics is trying to move beyond the whole that's conditioning all the parts, we can't stop it perceiving that whole in terms of the parts that are constrained precisely by what we're fighting against. The thing about colimits is that they actually kind of offer this strange way to introduce novelty by way of complexity, of binding, in terms of what Dennis presented of memory evolutive systems. And they work in an arrow sense in the exact opposite direction. In other words, whatever you're studying, in this case, again, Occupy, we're interested in asking the question, what are all the things that can be assembled together that make up Occupy? And the critical part that Rosen draws attention to, which we can see right down here, is that any given synthetic model, in other words, anything that you can kind of bind together, like we saw in MES, into a colimit, you can then turn around and decompose back into parts. However, just because you break something down into parts doesn't mean you can assemble those back into a synthetic model. And I think this is absolutely critical to understand some of the successes and failures of our work in Occupy. when you look at something at so high order like Occupy and 99% as a political abstraction, you're bound to break that up into all kinds of different parts and different components, which have different kind of like entailment relations, as Rosen would call it. In other words, kind of different logical orders of implication. And most of those, are interesting and revealing and kind of like phenomenologically enlighten a situation. However, not all of them kind of do what Lenin called kind of picking out the essential link. In other words, finding that place that we can then build a connection based on those constraints that then actually binds together different parts of a fragmented whole. I believe, and again, this is where bias comes in because these are things I was involved in and I'm pretty proud of our camp and the things that came afterwards. Our camp in Eugene was one of probably the longest lasting large scale camp in the country. And based upon people traveling up and down the West Coast, the best organized camp on the West Coast in terms of, again, logistical stuff. And I think that's because we politicized logistics and really took the idea that like we're essentially keeping a politicized refugee camp going, and that was kind of the correct synthetic model to then begin to stitch together what came next. And I'm going to jump a bit to the history of what came next right here. Okay, cool. So Occupy. Our camp did something which, as far as I know, no other camp in the country did. And I think that is the main reason that we were able to stabilize and last as long as we did. Main subjective reason. There are a lot of objective conditions. Eugene's a small town with a small police force. We have a huge, both hippie and anarchist activist population that brought a lot of know-how. And we have a very peculiar homeless crisis situation and support, kind of social support services around that. So there are a lot of objective conditions that we cannot look away from, and some amazing activists and all that stuff. But we did also have like a very particular political line that we developed. And that had to do with a splitting of our main camps, our main democratic meetings into two, which was to keep the General Assembly, which essentially maintained the kind of like political authority over the signifier Occupy, really is what it came down to, as well as the resources that had been collected, money and some donations and things like that. But really it was about, who had access to speak in the name of Occupy at the end of the day. And then what was just like the camp meeting, which met only a couple times a week, but had complete authority over all things that actually had to do with living on the camp, and only allowed people that lived on the camp to speak and vote. Anyone could participate and kind of fishbowl it. But it purely had to do with, living there and the rights that come with, a place being your home. And that, make a long story short, there's a lot of other work that went in, an insane amount of conflict de-escalation, but that stabilized our camp in large part because suddenly a lot of people who responded to issues originally by fighting us constantly suddenly were deeply invested in keeping everything going. That ultimately was still shut down by the police, and the name Housey is so problematic because so many of our supporters weren't there on Christmas Day when we got shut down by the police. So even though we lasted very long and had this great camp, unlike most of the big camps around the country, we did not have some great fight against the police or anything like that. It went out with a really sad whimper and a lot of people displaced. So that immediately turned into the next 2.5 years of a camping rights struggle, which was like really amazing and deserves its own kind of story, and is the work of a former partner in crime of mine predominantly, who really did great work. But I kind of need to skip over the details for the sake of time and cut straight to the last part, which was the main success, which was a 7-month-long homeless administered illegal camp with huge amount of community support that was called Whoville. And in it, we saw, it was very problematic. There were people with a lot of severe health issues, and there was a lot of stuff going on, a lot of trauma to work through, but we really saw what happened when people who had agency over their lives and their actual space, what the transformations that began to change. And the name Whoville itself was like this kind of meta thing that came out, even though like we didn't name it. It wasn't some clever thing anyone tried. It was just a name that someone who lived at the camp came up with, but it came to kind of stand in for the fact that, you know, homeless folks are often kind of that group which doesn't really get named in our society, or if it gets named as an object. And to kind of like bring the subjective political quality of the name back to those who've been kind of objectified in the process of capitalism, neoliberalism, all that fun stuff. But I think it also speaks to Lazarou's importance of like the name as a critical kind of binding point, and true binding in the sense from MES of a colimit that binds together multiple patterns and kind of cones of patterns and kind of builds a higher level system by that binding, and enables complexity to start to emerge out of that. So I'm going to actually skip this next slide. I'll probably come back to it at some point. And I'm actually going to skip, I think. Actually, I think I want to change my approach a little bit, because this is kind of the organic halfway point. And I do actually kind of want to see if there are any questions or thoughts, just as long as I can kind of reactivate my monologue later on. But I would like to kind of hear for a second if anyone has clarifying questions or comments or feedback or obvious problematics that come out of this that I'm missing or anything like that.
I have some things, but I think they can probably wait for the discussion later on.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just for the sake of clarification, you very early on you showed this slide just with like some definitions. Concrete entities are this, abstract entities are that. Like if you should just go back to it, just so I can. I mean, I imagine that understanding these distinctions is relevant for what's going to come later, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I
Okay.
wanted to kind of I wanted to put the glossary in the front instead of the back, just to make clear that I was going to be kind of assuming some terms, but I also didn't want to. I realize I'm going through a lot of stuff, and I didn't just want to like list off definitions.
No, sure.
But I can keep this up during the break and stuff too. I think this is probably the main one that's just like surplus of information.
I had a question. So this Rosen principle you invoke, it's really interesting. The one where every synthetic model has, like, you can break it down into its parts, but then not every set of parts can be reassembled to make a new synthetic model. Could you go over that again and how it applies in your view?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a lot of details I still don't understand. And he's dealing with something a little more specific called direct sums and direct products. But based upon what I've read elsewhere and following some things, like you can this kind of stuff you can abstract out to the limits and colimits. So basically, the way I understand it is you're kind of dealing with two different directions of entailment and implication. When you're starting from when you're building an analytic model, so you're using limits, you're starting from the whole and decomposing down to parts. So insofar as, you know, even from our own principle, everything is composed, you can always kind of find the kind of sinews and the joints of it, as you will, and kind of like taxonomically cut it up. However, the problem is, and Rosen gets into this very specifically with like what he considers reductionism in biology. A lot of biological, you know, laboratory scientists will take some organism, literally kind of dissolve it, break it down into its like chemical components, and then try to build a model that reassembles life from those components. And for Rosen, that's a fundamentally flawed, like there's a reason it hasn't worked. It hasn't been done well enough yet. It just is literally not the right kind of parts to assemble life. And so in a sense, what you want with a synthetic model is it's a way of detecting which parts actually generate the complexity that builds the new whole that you're looking for. So you can break things down into many parts, but not all of those parts can be turned around and reassembled, you know? So it's not like Legos. Like with Legos, you can always build something and take those exact same pieces. And that's kind of the reductive model. In fact, that's what Rosen calls, one of his many definitions of reductionism is that it identifies limits and colimits. It sees breaking down the parts and reassembling back up to the whole is the same thing, simply inverted. But in any open system, Rosen says by definition, those two aren't invertible. And if a physics or a biological system is open, then I'm pretty sure Occupy was an open system, in which case we shouldn't see the analysis, you know, and I think the analysis of the Reserve Army of Labor was a really tight analysis. I really liked it. It was really powerful and useful and helped me personally orient myself in the camp. But it still did, like it focalized, it gave us a way to kind of find the right pieces to then prioritize. But once we began to assemble back up, it wasn't exactly like, in a way, like this is a political example. I think like the analogy can be problematic, but I'm just gonna go with it, right? Like, the weird thing about, or the gross thing, or the sad thing about homelessness is some of the people that hate homeless people the most are fellow working class people. And so in a sense, like trying to solve the problem of binding simply from the perspective of like the working class wasn't enough to solve the problem. And as I'm going to get down to later, binding always assumes binding all three modes, right? Like that's, maybe that's another way to answer the question is you can decompose things into their pure modes and it's very interesting. But if you're going to bind things, you have to bind all the modes kind of from the ground up following this picture.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it's like you're starting down this path of setting criteria for choosing the right type of decomposition such that the binding problem could be like possible in principle, like, and it's only possible when, you know, some other conditions are met.
Yeah, and that's where, yeah, exactly.
I guess I'll just say really fast, like I'm so excited by this because I feel like it connects so effectively with so many of the other things that we're working on and I've also been working on. It's interesting that it's so focused on sort of the part whole relation, like it almost kind of feels like political Mariology to me or something. Like it's like you're looking at like, you know, what even is a whole? To what extent can we even speak of something as a whole? Like this is a really significant, like practical political question, but it's like one of the hardest things to conceptualize. And we have all these great resources for it, but like actually putting it together, like I feel like you're really gesturing in this direction, like, hey, this is relevant and we're working on it. But like all of the details, like practically and theoretically, it's like, you know, is there an answer to this, or like how many different answers can we develop in terms of like a scalar perspective? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I do think that it's a lot of it's trying to, at a certain extent, filter out the things that are interesting but not important in the moment. Which I think, you know, this actually does bring up that slide. This is a book I'm reading right now. Oh, Raphael's back. Welcome back, Raphael. It's from 2003. It's from before I think a lot of this stuff started to explode on the political scene, mapping and all that. So it's really interesting that Maria Lugones, who is like a Chicana feminist, queer feminist theorist, is writing about interactive understandings of intentions in terms of maps of oppression and the maps between those and maps of resisting. I mean, she pretty much uses exact categorical language. But I think, you know, a lot of what she talks about in this book, and which like is more, this is just a hint for stuff I'd like to present on next time. She's awesome, and there's a lot of other stuff in this area, but I think this starts to get to the question of like, in any given struggle, we are now very aware of like both a deep amount of social fragmentation and a deep amount of political intersectionality, and yet we're also constantly bound by these time, energy, resource constraints. And so I think this begins to give a way for us to actually like simultaneously highlight the places that are the most intersectionally oppressed and need to be given space, theoretically, in a way that, you know, can easily be kind of like crowded over in a lot of these theories, I think. But while also keeping, like, I think everyone in this group has a pretty strong attachment to the logic of it. And I think trying to figure out how this logic actually connects to the intimate kind of details, which is a lot of Maria Lugones's work. A lot of it's like, what does resistance look like in a domestic abusive relationship, and the little things that make that resistance not just a reaction, but an actual creative and experimental process in trying to find some like vector towards liberation. And this process, I think, you know, MES just seems so mind-blowingly powerful because it gives us a way to kind of think the scalarness of this, right? Like how we could be looking at this in the context of an interpersonal toxic relationship, or we could be looking at this in like a workplace, a classic class struggle, or we could be looking at this in like the weird diffuseness of white supremacy vis-a-vis Black Lives Matter in the United States. And that takes us nice and neatly into types, because types give us tractable, computable bookkeeping. And by that I mean, when I say tractable and computable, I mean essentially provable, right? Like these are rigorous things that a computer could do, or that a mathematician would write off on. And so finally, we're going to come to types, the title of this. And these are two paraphrased definitions by two of the, I think they're probably not granddaddies, they're probably daddies or uncles of type theory, but big players in the history of type theory. And they're also, I think, the best definitions I've yet to find of type theories in general, because there's a lot of type theories, which is type theories help to keep track of layers of abstraction, and they help to keep track of how components plug in and essentially input outputs between components, right? And, you know, with the abstraction layers, we have an idea that's very logical, something we're used to, indexing logical layers and kind of identifying them with modes and things like that. And then the compositional point of view, which for anyone that's done any programming, this is exactly how software design is talked about. You know, you make parts and you assemble them. What's interesting is Reynolds, who came up with the layers of abstraction, was a computer scientist, and Girard, who came up with the definition of plugins, was the logician. And I think that shows that at this kind of type theory is really kind of on the threshold between the way that thinking people, you know, us cognitive beings, try to like keep track of all these insane layers of abstraction, especially when we're looking at something like historical social formations. And at the same time that they are computable kind of constructs that a non-thinking just machine, like a computer, can, you know, compute, right? So they're these really interesting kind of structures that keep showing up for us, and they're part of this bigger thing called Curry-Haskell, or Curry-Howard, which I won't go in right now, but essentially brings together like the fact that things that are computable for machines and things that kind of like help clarify the relations of abstract, kind of the concrete abstractions for us conscious, somewhat conscious beings, are the same thing, right? And that's very interesting. And the kind of the basis of why I'm interested in informatic theory of organization, not because it's necessarily about turning everything to computers or how would a computer see this, but because informatics, which one of the big names, guy I really like, Philip Wadler, who's big in all this stuff, argues that we should call computer science informatics for a lot of reasons, but one of which is because it deals with something that's much bigger than just what computers do. And that if you look at organizations, this is my building on Wadler now. If you look at organizations, what organizations are doing is essentially computing information, right? And that's what we talk about when we talk about organizations sensing things and then also transmitting them, right? Because an organization might sense it. And this is actually a lot of what the Lenin piece I sent out gets into, right? That you have a party organization or some kind of organization in which the kind of bottom layers, the heterogeneous layers, are constantly sensing and interacting, experimenting in all these different kinds of political situations. And then they're passing information to some kind of centralizing function that's capable of building a picture and kind of extracting priorities from all that. There's a lot of particularities in that piece that are still kind of bound by the conditions of the Russian struggle. And, I do think there are questions about Lenin I'll come back to in a bit, but I think that there's a really powerful picture there, and especially a challenge, I think, to any organization. One which, by the way, I'll come back to, I think we're doing quite well on. But I'm going to stick to types for just a second longer. So just because I name dropped some of the big names in type theory and in no way, shape, or form am prepared to back it up, I am going to just briefly go through the three things I mentioned, because it seems like I should. But also, I mean, they're important, right? Because type theories always come out of a something else formal, right? Type theories are systems for keeping track of other formal systems. So we've heard a lot of talk about homotopy type theory, and there's a lot of ways to define it, but one of the simplest is it's the type theory that's natural to topos theory, and especially the toposes that were developed by Lever and his pals. But basically, like toposes, as we've learned it from Badiou and as we're using them, homotopy type theory is not the only, but one of the natural kind of ways to keep track of all the different layers, because topos theorists aren't concerned, it's like categories in general. They're not concerned with one topos. They're often concerned with tons of toposes and how they all map together. And as you build, a theory up, you're going to have a lot of different moving pieces. How do you keep track of all that? That's what homotopy type theory is. Constructor theory is a type theory that's being developed based upon quantum physics. And I haven't been able to get deep into it, but the main inspiration I took from constructor theory is that they use direct sums, the same thing that Rosen uses for synthetic models, to bind impossible states to make possible states, right? For the constructor theorists, quantum physics fundamental states are actually logically and physically impossible. Well, they're actually physically impossible. That's the main thing for them. And you have to bind together enough impossible states to make something that becomes a possible state where physically actual events can transpire, which sounds a lot like you have to bind together enough of these pieces to build something complex enough to be possible, and almost sounds like binding together the void to make a multiple. So I found that really interesting. But I think it's also important for our theory because essentially, following the Borromean knot idea, we're binding together different incompatible logics to make something that's physically, socially actual. So I think that there's something, maybe not, I don't know how much the technical details will be important, but there's a certain inspiration there in this idea of binding impossibilities to make possibilities. And then finally, domain theory, and I should have put linear logic here too, are two kind of type theories that come out of trying to model computations. And domain theory has actually been by far the biggest inspiration in this talk, because I use it to kind of understand the idea of ground and abstraction, which is kind of my weird way of combining my love of German idealism with type theory. But essentially what domain theory does is it kind of tracks layers of implication. And so if we think of, I'm going to jump back up for a second. Let's imagine for a second that the top layer with the wiggle and abstract is like the map we have from left to us by our good friend Carl from Capital, right? And we have not just any given part, but like the map, right, of Das Kapital. The entirety of that map implies all the little pieces within that map as well, right? And so in order to have the whole map, you have to have all the little pieces that make up that map. And as you kind of, and this is on the left-hand side, the limits and constraints, as you kind of move down to the ground, you ultimately break things up into their kind of like fundamental little parts and pieces. And it's often the little parts and pieces that we're actually like dealing with. I know this is a little vague. I'm going to try to tie this together a little better. But basically, the general idea is that we're dealing with an order of implication. The higher up you go, the more implicative power something has. And it implies all the statements that it takes to build up the system in the first place. I'll try to cash that out more completely. I know that wasn't the most complicated. But in order to do that, I'm going to completely change directions, as I'm prone to do, to try to explain why this makes sense in terms of this other big problem that has been on my mind for 15 years or so. Imperialism. Imperialism is an important problem for what we're talking about in terms of type theories, because we're dealing with, on the one hand, a characterization of the global, right? Like imperialism is the state that the entire capitalist system is supposed to be in. At the same time, it was very much presented, and still for adherents to imperialist theory, is presented as a kind of like local, a sufficient local explainer, right? That when you look at, for example, the so-called pivot to Asia by the United States to China, or the current like Ukraine-Russian war, that you can kind of sufficiently and satisfactorily explain those events in terms of the Marxist theory of imperialism. And if you look here, I've kind of highlighted the major words, the kind of major moments: monopolies, which in turn generate financial oligarchies. They're interested in the export of capital. And some of these things have changed. The export of capital is not as important, though it still remains actually a really critical part of neoliberal stuff and whatnot. But most of the definitions that you see, and again with these quotes down here, you see monopoly rose up concentration production, monopoly the most important sources of raw materials, a financial oligarchy, and then finally colonial policy. So just real quick, a quick summary. The idea of the classic theory of imperialism is that the capitalist nations, particularly France, Germany, Britain, the United States, had grown so large, and their respective capitalisms had grown so large that they were in a state of constant competition with one another, and that they'd run out of space to just kind of keep stealing from people to colonize, and that they were forced to constantly confront one another. And that in the direct competition between the economic powers meant that they were constantly trying to turn these colonized places into markets, into resource extraction points, into labor markets, into places to sell their things, into all kinds of stuff, right? But because predominantly of their competition with one another. So the competition between them defines the war, the structure of the wars, defines so much of colonial policy, defines like the details of how this system works out. And so I was really interested, given that a lot of how I came to political consciousness was the war on terror and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've been really interested in how the theory of imperialism holds up in the centuries or so since it was developed. And I found that while useful, while true, right? Like all these things are true, and you can kind of modify the details around what exactly is being exported and how much resources play. But generally, most of these statements still hold true. But they held true in a way kind of that gave explanatory capacity, but didn't really give much of a sense of what to do, or to follow the idea above, gave us a sense of the constraints, but not where the bindings were. And part of the problem was, I found, as I began to move the direction of my study, which was back before the theory of imperialism and the so-called age of imperialism, is that really almost all of the characteristics which are said to be attached to imperialism, minus in particular the export of capital, but most of the stuff about finance, most of the stuff about monopoly tendencies, most of the stuff about internal intra-capitalist competition driving external colonization and foreign policy and wars, most of that stuff has been in play essentially since capitalism really took off after the 100 Years' War, and especially since the 30 Years' War, and the English Civil War. There's always been most of the connections that were supposed to have really kind of come into their own in imperialism had really already been there in a lot of ways. It's true that they operated on whole new scales, but it wasn't exactly clear, in particular, how monopoly capitalism connected to the thing that Lenin and so many other people were trying to explain, which was the surge of national liberation movements and nationalism as a phenomenon, particularly one which was posing quite an ideological problem for so-called socialist working class consciousness. And one which, for example, Rosa Luxemburg was famously or infamously, depending on your side of this, critical of. And my basic argument is that the reason there's a problem here, and the reason in particular the connection to nations and whatnot has failed, and why Marxism has often failed to really kind of deal well with the question of nations and nationalism. And I saw Michael join the talk. I just wanted to give a shout out to his presentation because I thought it did a really good job of problematizing precisely the question of nations and nationalism. And I've studied this stuff for a long time, and it did a really good job of reminding me how much I still don't know about this. So thank you. I think those are great presentations. But that being said, I'm going to attempt to give some idea of what I think, based upon our theory, may have happened there. I'm going to jump back up for a second. So these 5 things here: monopolies, financial oligarchy, export of capital, international monopolist capitalist associations. These are the kinds of things, like I said, export of capital is more iffy, but the 1, 2, and 4 are all things that have been developing in different ways for much longer than the imperialist epoch, based upon my own research and reading of things. Point 5, the territorial division of the world amongst the biggest capitalist powers is completed, has been, I think, the single most underrated point of this, not because Marxists haven't taken stock of the fact that this essentially forced imperialist powers to constantly fight each other, but because they didn't let this idea raise from a kind of political fact or geopolitical fact to a theoretical abstraction. And I think that's because this problem really couldn't be defined without the tools that we're defining. And this is my attempt to address that. This is based on a conversation, ongoing conversation with Gabriel, in our attempt to understand A, B, and C and their connection, and particularly a weird thing about B, which I'll come back to. But I want to kind of just jump into this idea, right? So if we look at mode B, which just real quick is like the logic of 1, 0, either or, yes, no, true, false, like there's no intermediate ground, something either is or is not. Topologically, that tends to form a structure, a space that has a boundary, like we see here, in which one side is closed. In other words, you can go up to and actually hit the boundary point. And another side is open, which means you can infinitely kind of get close to, but never actually contact the boundary, right? And this is a very real, I think, abstraction historically, insofar as that this really gives the model of how empires and states in the pre-modern world were able to operate. There was the inside and the outside, and the outside often had this kind of mythological frontier or wildness, if not outright monsters drawn on the maps and whatnot, right? But there was a definitive sense that the boundary was the boundary of the empire, right? And that, for example, the Great Wall of China is China's wall, right? So there's a definitive inside and who gets to have that wall and who does not. With the capitalist enclosure of the world, you simply run out of the possibility of having this. Everything becomes a closed boundary. And that is the logic of mode A. That's the logic of spaces that share boundaries. And it's, that's literally the language that we use, right? Like nation states share a boundary. And the United Nations, however, like ideological the language might be, there's a reason that they talk about, I believe, the community of nations. Because however powerful US or any other imperialist epicenter might be, there is no ultra state, as like Kautsky and others theorize there might be. There is no term that follows that kind of like higher order state. So instead, what you end up having are nation states that have a kind of mode A topology in their boundary, and that mode A topology, I think, and the actual way that like social space transforms as a result of that is a way for us to map the actual like kind of rise of nationalism, not as a, you know, psychology of the true believer or a cognitively kind of like internalized ideology, but actually as a system of concrete abstractions which aren't just quote in people's heads, but actually like become part of the social space that people are navigating. That the enclosure of the world by capitalism forced a kind of structural change on the nature of boundaries and borders themselves. And we can see this, I would say, in Bukharin's famous splitting of the problem at the beginning of his book on imperialism. And he says that the core contradiction of imperialism is that you have, on the one hand, a global system of capitalism, which is highly interdependent, and in our terms is entirely organized on the logic of mode C, or predominantly, right? Optimized for mode C, let's say, optimized for profitability. And then a national system of capitals, which is in competition with all of its neighbors, and which doesn't necessarily prioritize the logic of property or profit per se, because it's willing to kind of like damage the overall system for its own localized profit. So it does prioritize its own profit, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the whole system will generate as much value as possible. No, it will in fact generally generate less, precisely because certain national capitals will take control of certain sectors for themselves or fuck shit up enough for everyone else, depending on it, right? So this contradiction leads to the problems. And I think we can begin to see, based on this topological map, that the national system of capitals and the kind of things that come out of that, export trade wars, and as like a negative side, and various forms of like trade agreements or like, you know, good neighbor programs and stuff, are really like not strictly speaking follow the logic of either states or capitalist markets, but rather a really complicated kind of level of almost gift exchange that happens between powers and stuff. But also, as we know from Mode A, lots and lots of skirmishes and rivalry. So out of imperialism, the main question that then starts to come is the rise of the state, because throughout this period, there are huge state capitalist projects, and most of the main political revolutions or main political counter-revolutions took the form of struggling over control of the state. And so what I want to argue, and this is in part, you know, leaning towards other stuff to be developed later and whatnot, but I want to argue that in order to try to understand mode B, we need to kind of separate it just from thinking the state and more from like thinking how these two other modes, mode C and modes A, interact. Mode B actually is a kind of bridge between these other two modes, and it's a way of kind of flattening informatic or abstract space in such a way as to make it easier to see everything, but in the same process kind of distorts or erases the interesting shapes of the spaces that come up out of communities and markets, right? And this is almost like a kind of everyday truism, right? Like governments are unimaginative. To a certain extent, B is precisely that unimaginativeness. I'm going to try to justify that a little bit. So here's some topology. Real quick, if we have a set, and let's just call it, you know, X, some set of some kind of social formation or some kind of social object, there are, you know, some subsets that belong to that object, and those subsets all belong to the power set, right? The power set is made up of all the subsets of X. In our logic, we are identifying the power set with mode B, right? Because that is the kind of model for Boolean logic. Power sets are both open and closed sets. So they belong in the top right to the set of all open sets or the set of all closed, open topologies or closed topologies. Now there's a lot of different ways to define topologies. I just went with the simplest, but basically you'll see that they're pretty similar definitions, open and closed, except for one key thing, right? You can intersect or take the union of two things that belong to the sets, and they'll still belong to a closed set. The main difference being you can take the intersection a finite amount of times of an open set, or the union infinitely times. You can intersect infinitely for a closed set and union finitely for a closed set. And just as a quick recursor or review, we have some space here in the middle. We have a bunch of spaces around it that also overlap. We have some space of interest that we want to do something with. That's what a union over that space is. And that's what an intersection is. So this is all probably review for all of you. I'm guessing all of you know this, but the main idea that's interesting here is that open sets, you can kind of like keep going out infinitely, but you're kind of constrained on how many, like you can do it finite times, but you can't kind of like take it to the next level of abstraction. You can't kind of jump, as it were. Closed sets enable you to kind of intersect infinitely down. So they give us kind of two different directions on how we cut up space. With open sets, we can kind of like take the liberty of zooming out and make sure we have the, we know that we'll stay within open sets. In other words, we'll stay within the logic of mode C. Sorry, I should have clarified that. We'll stay within mode C. We can keep zooming out as much as we want, and we'll stay within the logic of mode C, which would explain why it's such a great thing to encompass the entire world. On the other hand, we can zoom in as much as we want, and we'll still maintain the logic of mode A, which means we'll keep a boundary. We'll keep our boundary internal or with us as we zoom further and further in, which can explain, for example, why nation states can fragment again and again and again, and you can have a seemingly infinite, because you can literally have an infinite process of ethno-national conflict. Modular, I guess, number of people potentially, but the idea being here is like an organization that there's no limit to how much a nation state can break up, just as there's no limit to how much capitalism can kind of like extend out. And that these are topological characteristics that are derived from our theory, which is neat, I think. So, all right, so jump back up here again. We've got mode C, mode A, and now we kind of see how B can kind of connect to both at the same time. And we can see on the one hand that it can kind of regulate the problem of the nation state and the fracturing. And on the other hand, it can kind of like help to deal with all the problems of capital. And you'll see here I put monopoly capital, not state capital. Because what I want to argue actually is that the modern corporation is really B plus C. We shouldn't look at it as just C. We should look at the modern corporation. I mean, really, we should look at it as tied together by all three, but we should look at it as dominated by B plus C, because it actually has internalized a vast amount of kind of like state-like or military-like structure and processes of developing protocols that are not, I think, the classic kind of like, merchant or even manufacturing space. Like when we're looking at a modern transnational corporation, they're dealing with a level of sophistication and also product heterogeneity, right? Like we're not dealing with an industry anymore. We're dealing with complex tying togethers of multiple industries. So in some ways, like part of the problem with the analysis of imperialism is that it wasn't able to account fully for the form, even of the things that it thought it did such a good job of, like monopoly capital, because it wasn't really capable of seeing how something like mode B would impact the classic analysis that was derived from Marx. When you read Bukharin in particular, it's very clear that he's just developing the already extant concepts in Marx. He's adding very little, if anything, that's new. It's an exercise in conceptual derivation, and it's very good with good empirical evidence, right? But it's not it's not adding a new kind of abstract structure. And I think the thing is, the problems that imperialism was trying to deal with, following again the picture from up here, right, that there was a breakdown. when you tried to look at the constraints solely in terms of mode C and then turn around and build a movement, things were lost and you weren't able to kind of like reconstruct what you were trying to build. Okay. So now we finally get to my horrific version of the diagram. I'm sorry, there's so many beautiful versions of this that I had to just ruin it. So, but I just wanted to very quickly talk about this and then just end on two. Yeah, okay. So hopefully I should have 3 slides and then I'll be done. So this is our diagram, and this is directly from Guitar, except I changed around the letters, but otherwise it's the exact same thing. And I wanted to end on this because I think this is the structure out of which we're, this in conjunction with something like MES that Dennis just presented is really going to be the thing out of which we're going to be developing a type theory, right? And I realized I just skipped over something, the quotes from the other reading about a bridge, right? Which I'm actually not going to get into super right now, but basically, like, with topoces, we have the theory and the capacity to kind of like actually move, like if we start, for example, in C, which we're very comfortable with being Marxists, topoces enable us to rigorously kind of move between the different sections here and to study what happens to the spaces when you take away or add certain kinds of logics, right? So real quick, I just want to focus on this. For anyone, I think I saw one name, so just in case, this is the monster, this is our big diagram. The 3 logics that I've been exploring, A, B, and C, are all, in our terms, they're transcendentals. They're kind of the fundamental ways that we construct social relationships, and not just construct in the sense that we're intentionally doing it, but also which constitute our kind of possible space of social relationships. So we're in that kind of like classic constituting and regulating back and forth. And this is a diagram from a logician named Guitar, who is trying to capture, for different reasons, but a similar kind of idea of how do you tie together 3 different logics that are dependent on each other, that can't be separated, but which, because they're so complex, we do attempt to kind of like analytically explore just pieces of them at a time. And what that does when we cut some things out. The social side of this is from Karatani, where we're essentially arguing that A has the logic of communities, B has the logic of states and laws, and protocols is a term I've been using a lot, and C is the logic of exchanges, which ultimately things like prices really come to embody one. Now, K in the middle is our social world. It's the full, sophisticated, complex social world. So if we start with our transcendentals, with the 3 logics that I just kind of mapped out in terms of topology, they all map in to make our social world K, following what are called mono arrows. And what that essentially means is every single object, so let's say, again, we take Marx's analysis of mode C and we project it into, or I guess in this case, inject it into K, every part will have a unique part that it connects to in K, right? There won't be 2 different things in C that melt down and become one thing in K, which means that we can, if we have an object in K, we can always find its corresponding part in the transcendental in C. That's what's critical, right? That each transcendental, as it were, like has congruence and integrity with the objects that it maps to in K. Things don't get muddied from the transcendentals into K. We also have this theory, which again was a challenge that we've been working with following Guitar's diagram, and it just has continually generated good fruit. So we keep going with it, are these pairings. Now the pairings are defined by Guitar as the social world quotienting out one of the 3 transcendentals. So for example, A plus B is generated by quotienting out C. It also is an epi arrow out of K, which means that everything that's in A plus B is something that has been mapped from K. In other words, there's nothing in A plus B that isn't in some way or form in K in the first place, right? And this, I think, is really critical in the direction we've been developing these, because we've been thinking of A plus B, for example, as a space where like nationalism and populism kind of develops, and B plus C as a place of like logistics or technocratics, and A plus C is a kind of, actually that one's still kind of hard, I think, but you know, we've had ideas, but all of them have kind of like ideological limits too. In fact, Raphael Sedania brought up this idea from Badiou that you can essentially define ideology as taking something out of its context. And so in a way, each of these pairings are ways of trying to understand the social world when trying to understand it in its totality is just way too complex. It's a lot of work to try to understand the quote whole world. And so we want to try to understand a good chunk of it for less. And so we might look at one of these pairings, right? We might try to understand it in terms of how our communities and the kind of like regulatory structures that make them, kind of what we think of as a nation state, will start to perceive things and look at things and organize things under the notion of a nation state. But at the same time, if we look at these arrows from A and B, they are unqualified. They are neither epi nor mono, which means we don't know when you go from a transcendental into a pairing whether or not the objects collapse down. We don't know whether or not everything in A plus B is covered even by A plus B. We would assume so, but there's no way to tell that from the arrow, actually. So in other words, we can't recover the transcendentals that make up the modes directly from the pairings themselves. The only way to do that is to go back into the social world, right? And I think that this is an interesting way to kind of think about Marx's work, not from the finished product of Capital, but like the actual decades that he spent writing Capital, where he was constantly kind of like looking at different aspects of society and then kind of like moving from a specific aspect to the whole of society, and then looking from the whole of society back to his transcendental analysis, and then constantly kind of moving between these angles so that he could generate, for example, the 18th of Brumaire or any of his kind of political interventionary writings, which would focus on certain aspects and not others, right? And kind of cut up things in interesting ways. I think that this gives us a kind of map to simultaneously like understand ideologies and the problems there, and then also methodologize our own work. So I'm sure there's a lot there to ask questions about, but since I'm almost done, I'm going to defer it to that. Here's a quick thing, going back to Lenin real quick. Last time I spoke with Dennis, he mentioned that he was interested in kind of applying our theories to modeling what we're doing in STP. So I thought maybe one of the things to conclude on would be to say that I think we're doing quite well by Lenin in a way, because I think in a kind of way, for anyone that read the Lenin text, where there's this kind of dialectic between a homogenizing function of a central committee or whatever kind of group has a leadership function, and the heterogeneous function or makeup of the kind of rank and file membership that are bringing in all kinds of problems, right? Including problems that aren't reducible to the workplace, right? The Bolsheviks were very involved in issues with minority religious rights, minority nationalities, women's rights, even to a certain extent supported right issues, right? So there were a lot of ways to kind of like a lot of different things to intake, but in in the spirit of experimentation, you do have to kind of like set a hypothesis, set experimental conditions, and then carry out an experiment. And in a sense, the centralizing function helped to homogenize these various experiences into a priority, into a quote political line, and into a set of actual like practices. I would say what our work is doing is what I've called here diagrammatic type theoretic abstraction, which isn't just like the pictures or the type theory. This is my naming of a much larger process that we're doing. But if you look at the composition of this group, the examples that we've been using, even the means by which we're carrying out these projects, like I think that there's a lot of heterogeneous material that is going into developing the theoretical substance, some of which I just presented right now, which in turn is providing a kind of ongoing, thoroughgoing homogenization of method that we're turning around and applying, experimenting, testing, and I think following comments actually from Gabriel's symposium on his book, which they spoke at length about listening in a psychoanalytic context. I think listening in a kind of political context is critical here, right? Like, I think one of the things the modes can help us to do is really kind of open our ear to listening to other registers of kind of logic and reasoning that maybe our theoretical frames might not always encourage us. And these arrows, as I said, are informing sensing. So in both senses, right? It's not just information going up to the center and directives coming down. It's different kinds of information, right? And I think following Rosen, we should probably also not think of this as easily invertible. In other words, the arrows going up aren't the same as the arrows going down. And I think that might be a critique of Lenin. I'd have to dig into it more. But I think he, certainly theoretically, he had a bit of reductivist bent when it came to certain of his readings. And I think sometimes his organizing theory, I think, didn't take seriously the stuff of organization itself that we're getting into. But I definitely want to kind of do some more research before I put out too hard of a thing. So it's going to end on these two slides. Okay, so an example that I find interesting that I've just begun to research, but I think is an example of tying together the modes is the agroecologia movement. I've been focusing on the one out of Cuba, but I know that the agroecology is tied to the land movement in Brazil. There's a heavy urban farming movement in Mexico City and Cuba, or in Colombia and elsewhere. And essentially, it's a very like intense ecological program to try to transform how we grow food to deal simultaneously with like the climate crisis and the mass unemployment crisis. And in fact, it developed in Cuba in the 90s as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union and the continued pressure of the US blockade. Essentially, Cuba had to figure out how to grow food without relying on oil consuming machinery. So they moved food production to the cities and underwent an intense localization process, and at the same time used methods, biointensive farming, permaculture methods to make far more kind of like micro farm ecosystem, complex ecosystems of food. So instead of growing one thing, they grow many things in many places. And I think agroecologia is a very good example of tying together, binding from the bottom up, the three modes. In mode A, it gives a very real kind of real example of what Marx called like social metabolic interaction. And I think in a way it's mode A precisely in the sense when you see people talking about it, it's interesting because it's simultaneously a very kind of precise scientific language. I mean, this is definitely like agronomy and not the hippie kind of permaculture stuff I was exposed to 10 years ago. But at the same time, there's still very much a logic of kind of interchange with the environment, right? Like it's very much like we're giving to the environment in order to also receive a gift back from the environment. And the entire kind of methodology of the inputs and outputs of the composting systems of like the division of land has to do with like creating a net positive. And I mean, the food production, I did some numbers real quick. It's something like 4 times the food per square area of like monocropped corn production in the United States. Like the food production yields are insane. There's something like 140,000 people employed through agroecologia. And it produces way cheaper and healthier food than the other farms in Cuba. It's also mode, so that's mode C. It's actually highly efficient commodity production, and in a certain kind of way is actually closer to a real bargaining space because it is so localized, and the inputs into the food production are so much more kind of contingent on the local environment. So it's all it's kind of more sensitive to markets than what happens under monopoly capital. And then you see a whole system of protocols develop. In fact, one of the fellows that runs one of the farms was talking about how you could define agroecology as a kind of rigorous systematization of various farming techniques. And so there's a kind of like rigorous protocol process that comes in that, you have this kind of like almost hippie level kind of interchange with the ecology, and side by side with that, you have very rigorous scientific like methods. And not just like in laboratory, like the way they produce their starts, the division of seeds to starts, the actual planting process. It's fantastic. I do little bits of permaculture, micro farming stuff myself. I'm a complete amateur compared to these guys, but it's a beautiful thing to see. And again, if it's a very real political thing that has employed lots of people, it feeds Cuba or does a substantial amount of the feeding of Cuba, and has created communities, and not just communities in the human sense, but like I said, a larger kind of like local ecological interaction. So 3 kind of philosophical takeaways I want to leave us with that I haven't brought up, but are all things that I've been thinking a lot about. Well, the third one I literally just did. But I think like in a kind of way, because our theory is, all of the modes, they have to do with objects. And if you look back at the definitions, which I'll leave up during the break, objects are what essentially types are, types of objects are what we're trying to get to, right? And I think, this is deeply inspired by the Maria Lugones work that I'll be hopefully presenting on more down the road. But I think part of the idea here is 1 and 2 are interconnected, which is essentially, I think we need a theory of something like partial subjects, that we're always already kind of like the impossible states of constructor theory. Like we aren't starting from full subjects, right? And this isn't, necessarily talking about like the question of individual subjectivity or whatnot. This is talking about political subjects, but though even in individual subjectivity, there's a lot of stuff about multiple kind of selves and personas, but I'll leave that to the side. That we're always dealing with building subjects, and that we're kind of starting with partial subjects, and that the asymmetry, the dialectic of limits and constraints on the one hand, and colimits and bindings on the other hand, help us to kind of like select the partial subjects of the moment, right? The essential links in the chain, following Lenin. And then I think the flip side of this is, following Lacan and Zizek and the subject supposed to know and believe, I think that one of the specters that kind of haunts this moment of politics is the subject supposed to control. The subject supposed to control is certainly there in conspiracy theory, but I think it's something that's more than just knowing. And I think especially the more I read JP's work on concrete abstraction, I really do think like there's something about the behavioral aspect of control and not just the epistemics of believing or knowing that are really critical here. That that I think both in the sense that a lot of politics wants someone or some group or something to be in control, and that often we assume that someone's in control when in fact there's not. That there is something really important here, a certain kind of fantasy that real political organizing is actually constantly working through. That on the one hand, the whole point of there's this idea of democratic control on the one hand, that we do want control, but in a democratic sense. So what does that actually mean? And on the other, that there's this very real way that we're kind of like haunted by being controlled, often in a way that's phantasmatic, but by no means because of that less politically effective. And I think that these issues really can kind of get worked through in terms of thinking of social reproduction as a kind of tying of a knot of the 3 modes, like I proposed agroecologia does, and that in turn, to kind of tie it all back together, is really a matter of composing types. And so with our theory, as we get more clarification on social types properly, we actually begin to develop a grammar and even a kind of interface to build experiments, test them out, and to try to like, work with others in new and interesting ways, and also hopefully ones that are resilient given everything we're dealing with. So thanks for that. I appreciate your time and attention, and I look forward to the discussion. And I'm going to, like I said, leave you on that. And it's 3:34 my time, so let's maybe get going again at 40 after, 40.40, whatever your particular hour.
Yeah, just take like 5 minutes, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly.
Is that enough, guys, or you want more of a break?
For me, 5 is okay.
Yeah, just like can feed the dog and come back.
Okay, well, 5 minutes and I thought I covered a lot of ground, but I'm reading through the chat now, and you all are definitely giving me just as much ground to cover in return. So seems fair. Oh, life itself and essays on life itself, Anna, in relation to Rosen. You're back. In fact, we are about 5 minutes in. Do we have everyone back? Does anyone?
I think, well, I'm here.
Okay. Just gonna go for it. Yeah, just wanted to, I'm not great at citations. Anna, yeah, Life Itself and Essays on Life Itself by Robert Rosen are my main two references for all this stuff. And if you want the shortest version, chapters 5 and 6 in Life Itself. That's where he really gets into category theory. And chapter 6 is all about analytic and synthetic models.
Really looking forward to reading that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great. For me, he's done more to make me understand category theory than any of the category theorists, who I love, and there's some interesting stuff, but it's really hard, I think, to kind of get a sense of what to do with this. And he's really good at kind of explaining the math and the science, and while keeping it hella rigorous. So it's a good vibe for this group, I think. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have any, I've exhausted my direct ability at this point. So I could kind of go through the chat, but if people want to just start saying things on their mind, asking, polemicizing, what have you, we can do it.
You covered so much ground, and I just want to say it was like just so many different connections that were all so exciting to me. I'm not even really sure where to start, but like I feel like there's a lot that's sort of percolating in this presentation that's like has a lot of like feelers out to connections that are being developed other places. I'm sure that like this is going to come up in the discussion. I'm just trying to think of where to jump in from.
I'm glad it is connecting things. It's kind of, it was definitely a goal this time around. Gabriella?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was really cool, really helpful. I mean, it was great to see that, like all these debates we've been having about, okay, how to move, because I mean, we are working on this logic separately, right? But working on them separately is not gonna solve the problem of what it means to work on all of them at the same time. So that's actually a separate, I think it's the first time anyone has discussed this in any detail. And I have the impression, so this is one thing I wanted to hear your comment on, which is, I have the impression from your presentation that you're suggesting that looking into types and combination of types might be an easier or more organic way to look into the combination of these different logical spaces and so on, than by trying to connect them like at this global level, right? So looking at this, so I feel like that's a big hypothesis on what you're proposing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good, succinct.
And I was thinking that, I mean, just for the sake, because you presented this, but just to make sure we don't go over it too quickly, like if you could either go back to this. I mean, you have just the distinction between open and closed, but just check something here. Like, I'm not sure how to do this. Can I just share my screen and then you tell me if we can work on this?
Yeah.
Here, just 1 second. Here. So this is what you presented really quickly, right? So we have like these different transcendentals, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you showed, and you give really good examples of this different kind of basic composition of spaces that we are proposing for each of them. So you get a paraconsistent logic if you compose a space where every subset of that space is closed. So if I have two subsets and their boundary will belong to both of them, right? And you have a classical logical space if one of them is closed, so the boundary belongs to this, and the other one is open. And you get an intuitionistic one if it's kind of like a fuzzy boundary here, right? You can't really tell where both are kind of open, but they superimpose in the case that they touch each other. Okay, I get it all the way here, but then my point is, what does this mean in terms of distinctions for types? Is there any name for how these things are distinguished at this level? Like, you see my point? Like, I have the impression that this is the correct. I agree with you that there's something about this level of analysis that seems more tractable for us to discuss how these things get combined, but I'm just lacking in my intuition. Would these be the domains? Like, would the domains of types be, closed subsets with open complements and open subsets?
Yeah, I think
that's
so.
That's what we're saying, right? That almost like the names in a paraconsistent type theory, they're naming only closed domains. So domains that include the border of that domain also falls under the type. Something like, does that make sense? Like,
I think so, yeah. And that seems to be like in domain theory, which is the type theory for computations, they use topology to define essentially like a data type or something, and then the operations on that type, and then you use typing to kind of keep track of all that, so you don't have to carry around all this semantics all the time.
So I see.
Similar. We start with defining a topology. We'd also, this is why I think the diagram is important, and we still, at least I don't know what this means, but like, what are the compositional kind of operators? I think, like, limits versus colimits, sums, all this stuff, I think is still kind of up for grabs, at least for me. But types would be like the topologies combined with those operators. And that would be a domain and domain theory type. And yeah, I think that's what we're naming, very much so. Yeah.
Okay, so this is kind of like the basic kind of anatomy of reference in a language according to each of these, right? So yeah, it's not like types are let's say sorry, I'm just being a stupid motherfucker. So I can have like a name or a concept or something I use to refer to things. Types are actually gonna have to do with the referent of the name.
Yeah, there's some, yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, name and type are not identical. Absolutely, yeah.
So for example, we could make exercises where we take some political name that we use all the time, like, I don't know, whatever, and then try to vary what it applies over and see that, if we're correct by changing the domains here from between the modes, we might get something like it changes something like this, right?
You essentially just delineated the perturbative method for politics, right? Like, you can, small modifications, does it still keep its generic form? And I think that in many ways that goes back to like the Lenin, like when he says things like, you went just a teensy bit too far to the left with like all power to the Soviets during the July days and things went bad. Like that, in other words, you can kind of push out beyond, and then suddenly the domain breaks and like you're no longer binding anymore. So it gives us a kind of like sense of what, and yeah, exactly, that a domain, a name might not kind of get stretched beyond the binding capacity of a space or something.
Yeah, I think other people have their hands raised. Okay, yeah. I just want to make sure if I'm following it correctly. And
no, that was great. That was a really good summary. I appreciate that. Anna?
Oh yeah. So wow. One thing I was actually just thinking with that was all really exciting is I was really into that Olivia Caramello essay that like you put up on like the reading for this meeting. And I was really wondering like how that connects in with all of this, because you talked about type theory and you talked about the Lenin piece, but I didn't really hear direct connection to that. And like, I've been thinking a lot about like political translatability.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe what Gabrielle was just talking about is sort of a similar thing. Like how does that connect to like I forget the exact term she uses, but like, that's also kind of what Caramello was talking about, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I did end up kind of passing over her stuff in silence. But basically the gist of it that I took was she kind of distinguishes topos theory from set theory and category theory insofar as with set theory and category theory, you can show to a mathematician or whatever that two things are the same. You can verify by a computer that'll then tell someone that they're the same, but you can't actually turn something into something else. This is a huge problem for science, right? Because like if you're a physicist and you're studying like particles appearing, they can appear in such a way that you can then look at it and say, okay, they make this kind of topology. But then I want to simulate what that looks like over light years. I'm going to have to compute that, which means I have to turn into some other kind of structure, not a topology, but something in linear algebra with matrices, right? Now, I might be able to turn something into a matrix, but I'm not guaranteed once I add it all up to be able to recover a topological space on like a higher level, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm following it. I mean, I guess like this idea, like how she defines between like or the distinction she makes between those things that you were just talking about, like where there's some kind of equality with like a referent or something. Equality is probably not the correct technical word. Versus like sort of the translatability versus just like the homology, I guess. I feel like this is like such a key thing where it's like it kind of comes back to the conversation that was being had in like the WhatsApp and then followed up on in the Zulip about like mode D and like mode D versus org and like what is sort of like the like orientable aspect of STP. I feel like I've sort of been thinking of it in terms of translatability and in terms of like how different like political movements, like where is the space in which their ideas are translatable among each other. And like that was sort of one of the things that like that Caramello essay really got me thinking was like, is there a way to actually integrate that into the formalisms? Like, is there a way to talk about this distinction between like, maybe there are like social worlds that involve a certain kind of homology, but there are also like ways to translate that aren't homologous, but that there is like some kind of like translation protocol, and maybe not a protocol. I keep using that word, but it's like it has this legal connotation I don't like. I don't know what a good alternative is, but do you sort of get what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think I think that's very much very similar to what I wanted to kind of put out there, and like part of the reason I wanted that with the Lenin piece was, in a sense, like what he calls a central committee and what kind of Rodrigo calls like a leadership function, has that kind of like transforming kind of role in this particular sense, right? Like it takes something from one area and really needs to like, it's responsible in a sense for like relaying whatever made that information significant in the theory without losing that significance, right? And that's the main thing toposes can do, is they can guarantee, because with sets and with category theories, you already have to kind of know each side. That was the main point I was trying to make. You have to know A and B, and then you're trying to show that they're the same. With toposes, you can start with just one side, and if you know the transformation procedures, you can get to the other thing without knowing what it is, right? And so if we don't know where we're going in a certain kind of way, but we want to know that we're preserving certain kinds of relevant information, toposes seem to give us a structure exactly to translate that, and to, you know, the same thing like a professional translator needs to worry about, keeping the essence of the text, whatever that is defined to be, in translation. And so in some sense, yeah, toposes can do that in a way that you can't carry out with set theory. And I think it's interesting that they can do that for mathematicians and scientists, and that at the same time we're finding them so powerful as political tools. And I think the ultimate question with that is you can actually like build toposes, like you can program a topos, you can make one as a computer and run. And I'm wondering like what it actually means to take a topos as like an architectural principle for organization. And I think that that's an interesting question. If like toposes give us a model of basically the way worlds work, what does it mean to learn from that about how we organize? But beyond that, yeah, I don't think I have a lot to take away from the text that it sounds like you already took away, because there's a lot of technical details. And generally, most of the questions, a lot of Gabriel's questions too, he just asked, I think, call for a level of technical prowess I don't have. And in many cases, based on my research, a lot of this stuff, especially how like closed sets and open sets interact and all this stuff, like it hasn't necessarily been developed because we're asking questions in a way that haven't been applied. You know, there's been a lot of stuff for quantum physics or for like data analysis on optimization problems, but not for what we're trying to do. And so hopefully, as we get better at formalizing this, we can pull in more formalists that can then kind of take us down the road of whatever madness that entails.
One thing that I think we're also approaching that is quite interesting, which is, you know, I remember talking to Caron often about this kind of inverse picture of language. Like a lot of people who want to argue why we need, you know, some extra tools, or we need science or whatever, tend to point to the poverty of language, and then you need something more because it's inaccessible. And we always go back to this point that sometimes the problem is that it's just too much. Like, you know, you want something weaker because sometimes language can just, because there is no cost of making any connection between any two things. You can make a sentence like,
It's a seamless medium. This
yeah,
is the
like,
problem.
yeah, exactly.
You
like
can do whatever you want with language. This is actually a problem. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, so the costs, the syntactical costs of sentences don't correspond to any actual economic costs of worldly connections. Like, so I can say things like a unicorn was in the sun, and like, I'm just connecting something that doesn't exist with, you know, a huge star. And it's the same kind of, I learned nothing by saying that, and I could say any other sentence, right? So on the surface, it just sounds like it's too rich of connections and too kind of, as Caron said, seamless in the way that it can do any of these connections. So, but the weird thing is that, you know, once you have this vocabulary that we by chance arrived at, I don't even remember how we got to this, like at this point, that each mode has a logic. And I mean, I'm always amazed that it works. I do think that we should take like some Monday meetings just to stop and like contemplate this fact, because it's, I mean, what? But given that, like, once you actually try to compose these things together, you get back at a seamless thing, because ultimately a complex space based on, you know, closure algebras, Boolean algebras, and intuitionistic blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you can have concepts with clear boundaries, with fuzzy boundaries, with paradoxical boundaries, which is pretty much the whole thing. But the difference that we arrive at that, so we arrive at a seamless thing. Like, once it makes sense, right? To go back to your explanation of the nature of the arrows from the modes to K, and then from K to, it makes sense that I'm leaving very neatly defined spaces with like only closed, blah, 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 only open subsets. And then when you arrive at the world and you mix them together, now you can't tell them apart, because you can get two closed things that are actually two kind of states. But now it looks like a community logic, as you showed. But now if you try to arrive back at mode A from the composition of states, you don't get mode A back. Right? I mean, I'm not sure if you did it on purpose, but remember when Michael was presenting and we were talking about this distinction, like I proposed this hypothesis that we have a strong thesis about the logic of affinity, right? That it's paraconsistent, meaning it is all about closed subsets, and you have like inside and outside, and the boundary is both inside and outside. And you were saying that it's funny that the two kind of contemporary community building logics, which is populism and nationalism, they split this into two. Either you have inside and outside, very strictly defined, like in nations, or everything is kind of inside and outside. Everything is just the boundary, which is like populism. Everything can kind of fall into the mass, right? And it was weird to find that, well, when you reconstruct the logic of mode A inside modern capitalist states, you never get the full paraconsistent thing to work, even though you're still clearly working into community logic. And today, I think you showed very nicely how you can do that. If you build states, their outsides are open, but the boundary belongs to them. Well, but the moment that you have two states touching each other, both will say the boundary belongs to them, even though they work in classical. So again, it becomes the whole mess. You cannot decompose this into the pure modes, right? So why am I saying all of this? Because I feel like we now arrive at a place we resisted dealing with for like 2 years, which is we can now get to language back, and we ask questions about messiness of categories and language types and things, but we have this other picture of language where we treat it as the place we arrive at. Like, yeah, it's messy because we mixed pure things into this mess, rather than assuming we would ever be able to get back from language to those things, which we already know we cannot, right?
Yeah, we are following Marx's method in the Grundrisse, in a certain sense, of having the concrete as a combination of multiple abstractions. But at the same time, the concrete we have back is not really tidy, right?
Exactly.
So actually applying Marx's method gives us more work to do.
As always. But, you know, like, this is where I think that you mentioned this in the middle of your presentation, and I was talking to Rafael before we started, that, you know, sometimes I feel, at least for myself, when I get a kind of a super egoic pressure to have a clarity of how do we apply all of this, the first thing I always go to is like, we should be able to analytically distinguish things very clearly, right? Which is, so we would talk to organizations and we would be able to tell them many things about what they're doing, or we would see many things about what they're doing. But what you actually showed and what the discussion is leading is the fact that, well, if we're serious about this idea that there's three logics and they mix into social world, you're describing a process through which we lose the capacity to unbind these things back analytically, right? So what you can actually do is not analytically decompose these things into primitives, because we cannot, right? I think what you can actually do, which is kind of counterintuitive, because we study so much and we're like saying we need to study history, anthropology, sociology, political economy, mathematics, biology, blah, blah, blah. And then the output is that we are in a position to know even less, to prescribe even less. So you can actually, let's say, navigate the language of that particular region of the social world in more detail, right? So it does make sense that, let's say, having a nice kind of, even I think we should even do some examples, like some literary experiments, you know, like, I wonder how if we can like do stupid examples, like take 3 sentences where they're clearly working under these different logics. So we take some verbs, nouns, adjectives that clearly mirror a bit better, you know, if we're talking about clear-cut divisions, you know, like statements about enemies. Enemies are great for this because they're meant to be others. But like if you're talking about your mortal enemy, it's somebody with whom you share an honor. If you're talking about an enemy in the sense of like a state enemy, it's like a criminal, you don't share anything, you know. And if you're talking with somebody who is your competitor, your enemy in the capitalist sense, there's always some room for negotiating, right? Yeah. Like, how do you collapse this into one picture? You know, like we could actually take this sort of linguistic constructions and actually work them through this machinery and kind of see what it happens, you know, when somebody is at simultaneously all these 3 things. And I don't know, yeah, sorry.
So I don't know if this is helpful at all, but one of the things that this made me think of is like the way that, you know, the fact that when you can't recompose something when you decompose it a certain way. It's like when someone tells a joke and then tries to explain why it's funny, like sort of like that aspect of like, you know, how there's something that only functions if it's not explained, right? I feel like there's an extent to which this is like, I don't know, I feel like there is a tendency in this direction in any whole, right? That like is maybe sort of what Rosen is getting at. And I don't know to what extent that should be incorporated into this, but it seems relevant in some way.
Maybe we should read a little bit of Rosen. I didn't read the book, the Life Itself book. We could schedule something. Seems to be crucial to this issue.
You know, like there is something, also John could comment on this a bit, because it is very clearly a connection between what John presented today, what Dennis was presenting until now. and more generally, something we've been discussing, because Rosen has this weird definition of complexity, which was very counterintuitive, which has to do with this analytic syntactic distinction, right? He doesn't like dynamical descriptions of complexity. He likes Platonic ones. He's the most Platonic biologist ever.
Oh yeah.
And his distinction is like all models of mechanic systems are simulatable, but every complex system has at least one non-simulatable model, right? Isn't it something like that?
Something like that. Yeah, yeah. You can't reduce it down to what you need to. Yeah.
Yeah, you cannot reduce it back to the parts, right? So it's exploring that distinction between you can compose it, but you cannot decompose it and run the system on the parts and get the result of the whole, right? Mm-hmm. And it's very, like, he has something of this kind of categorical discussion of complexity, and then is provided like a more sophisticated even one with Ehresmann, with that idea of the multiplicity principle, which again is not dynamic. It's just saying if you have one colimit for two patterns based on the same graph, and they are binding with other things in weird ways, the binding of the link of those links will not be reducible, right? So again, it's not. Yeah. So I don't know. It would be really interesting to understand, like, because we ultimately have a similar theory of complexity, right? Our theory of complexity in everything we've been doing is more about multiple things having the same unity, and then this messes up how you combine things in this universe, right? Then dynamic things that produce emergent effect because you run them in chaotic ways. Like there is no chaos, but there is emergent property. That's the weird thing about it.
Right? Yeah, I will say that. Yeah, there is. It seems there is emergent properties at least. Yeah, but
yeah,
chaos is that.
Oh, sorry.
Chaos is in the end. Not in the beginning.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it goes back to the language thing. Like, you don't start from language as the chaotic thing, and then we're messy and we want to arrive at something new. We can almost explain why, let's say, the language of social phenomena is complex. Like, it looks chaotic, right? It has the properties of something chaotic, rather than the inverse. We are in a chaos, and then we're gonna arrive at it. So it's weird. I don't know. I always find this counterintuitive somehow.
It's interesting, like when you talk about like the technical definition of chaos. So I got really into this one physicist, Per Bach, who like works on like complex systems theory. Like he has this book, like How Nature Works, that he's definitely more on the sort of like dynamical side of things. He came up with this sort of like self-organized criticality kind of theory. But one of the things that he says like over and over again is that complex systems are like not chaotic. Like it's not chaos that we're actually dealing with, it's complexity. And making the distinction between chaos, which is just like there's no order, and complexity, where there is an order, but it's like it's like the order of like the roughness. Like he compares it a lot to like fractals and that whole kind of discourse. But like, I mean, I feel like, and I saw there was a little bit of discussion of that in that MES text, but like, you know, there is an order in some way, but like how you approach that order is not going to be through any kind of like straightforward decomposition. Like you have to look at the things that seem chaotic in order to find where like they're actually not chaotic, you know?
Yeah, that seems like René Ton's critique of the indeterminacy people. Like he's upholding like Laplacian determinism, something like that. But the effect of chaos, he seems to say something to the lines of, it is the effect of inadequate kind of framework for describing it. So you have like little islands that are, for instance, mathematically describable, and islands that are better describable by natural language, and so you go. So you go on. So, and there are dynamical processes wherein if you keep the same language where you're describing it, you lose information as you go on. So you have to switch your descriptive framework in a certain sense. So it is a way for him to say that chaos is always relative to a framework, actually, something like that. And actually, there is one point of view somewhere where you get a full description of the phenomenon. Maybe the problem is we don't know which point of view. So it seems kind of, I'm not sure if it's the same, but it seems like kind of related to that.
All of this also seems very Bogdanovian, like the organizational point of view, everything is organized, right?
I think it's worth using Rosen's distinction on this point, because he distinguishes between complexity that von Neumann defined, which is still the kind of general term, which is essentially like layers of stuff built on layers of stuff built on layers of stuff. And Rosen calls that complicatedness. And he argues that that is not complexity because you can ultimately break it back down. So a computer is a great example of something that's complicated. You can reduce it all the way back down to its fundamental logical operations on the motherboard, and you can fully reconstitute it, right? Whereas complexity is defined, like actually like borrowing from Dennis's presentations, is defined by the multiplicity principle, right? Like if something is complex, you can't reduce it down. You will always lose some information. And so I think that would run at odds with the ideal observer position thesis, right? Which seems to be more on the complicated, that if you added enough additional layers of model structure, you'd eventually get to something that captures the system. Whereas an open system, by definition, there is no absolute, there are better and worse for sure. And otherwise he wouldn't be a scientist, but, and in fact, they're much better, right? And that's why he likes, for example, direct sums and synthetic models. He thinks they give a much better explanation of how life works. But it doesn't mean that like the best synthetic model still won't cut out critical information at that threshold. And that's, we got to remember with Dennis's presentation, he was dealing with one colimit that left one multiplicity principle. Like a single cell will have countless multiplicity thresholds. Our social organizations are just knots of, you know, so like to a certain extent, I think social theory will need an extra level, a somewhat Hegelian level, a geistige level, where like the folding back on itself gets factored in a way that it doesn't. And this is something actually coming out of conversation with Dennis, I think is very important. When you're looking at things with Rosen, names are labels, which means they're arbitrary and can be removed, right? Like nothing counts on a name and its effective causality. Whereas in the analysis I just gave, coming from Lazarud, names are part of the world that they are naming, right? They are labels that have effective symbolic efficacy, right? So, and binding, at least potential binding capacity, right? And explanatory semantic capacity. So they are part of a world, and that makes all the difference at the end of the day. And I think is one of the good starting places in defining what's the difference between these things for natural versus social and whatnot. But I think, yeah, a lot of times, like, I think, at least for Rosen, I'm not saying like we need to take this, but at least the direction we're heading right now, if we're gonna rely on MES and Rosen, is that complexity is fundamentally irreducible. There will always be at least two, if not more. I think for us, there's always gonna be at least three explanations with the modes, but maybe not. But yeah, there's always gonna be something cut out. Gabriel, and then
yeah, I mean, I would just, I mean, I have a bit of a hard time. I mean, I know Lazarus uses the word anthropology of the name, like the name, he uses this concept all the time. But I don't know, I have the impression that, I mean, if you look at what he actually does, this is not, I mean, it's definitely not discourse analysis, or I mean, I don't think you find the idea of symbolic efficacy in his work very often. Like he clearly is more concerned with thinking and saying things like, for example, I don't give a shit these people are saying they are right-wingers. What they're actually doing while they say this is something else. Mm-hmm. So there is a bit of a, you know, what he means by name is much more how you kind of parse reality out, and not the labels that this parsing take on. Right. That's why he
like the real abstraction stuff.
Yeah, it has much more this feeling than this kind of what you label it after, right? So
yeah, that was my question, kind of like, yeah, what's the meaning of name there exactly in your presentation? Like you started with a comparison between Rosen and Lazarus, and I was kind of lost on what is the exact relationship, because as Gabriel was saying, I'm more inclined to think that, yeah, names are important, but they don't have this particular kind of, I don't know, substantiality in the situation, other than as an after effect of its adoption. But if you accept the thesis of the after effect of the adoption of the name, you are in the populist camp. So it seems that the theory becomes kind of indistinguishable of what the populists want with the idea of a name, which is a kind of after effect of its adoption. So it seems that you are looking for a more situated approach, wherein you could explain where is the glue, how the things are getting glued. That is not just, I don't know, the word Lula right now in Brazil. I don't know, that.
Yeah, admittedly, I'm vague on this, and I probably won't be able to give a satisfactory answer all the way. I will definitely be working on this though going forward. And this is one of the big questions I realize already. But a few things. Yes, I realize I'm using it in different ways. I'm trying to take Lazarus as a starting point, but I also honestly find anthropology, the name, very dissatisfying on a lot of levels. And so like part of it, for example, going back to Occupy, going back to the, like, I'm thinking of like the name Occupy as a name here, right? Which, right, like it's a complex name. I guess I could already start to opt out of a good answer just by saying there's so many ways to reduce it. I can't possibly give you no, but I think, yes, there's like this way that the name like provides kind of a scaffolding and a structure. And there was, I would say, with the name Occupy, a lot of kind of organizational political semantics that came with that, like what that meant and how to like kind of embody that and carry that out. But at the same time, the word occupy, and this is kind of what I was saying about the General Assembly, it also circulated as a signifier that meant something when you attached it to things. It was a political object that was fought over, both like in the big mainstream media, but also very much in every single General Assembly. What is this going to mean in the context? And so it kind of operated in the way I kind of interpret Lazarus, kind of like naming an opening of a world for political kind of like in a political interiority, which Occupy certainly was. But the problem is, I think, and I really don't like the way he, like, I think his interiority, exteriority stuff is kind of mechanical and we can do a lot better at the end of the day. But part of it is like the name doesn't stop at being the name of like a political interiority. It also is a name in a system of signifiers that is like invested politically with power relations and blah, 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 all that stuff. And so I think basically in answer to your question about populism, I think that this is the value of the other side of the arrow, right? And this is in fact a classic Marxist critique of populism, that you don't really have a theory to understand where to put your emphasis. You don't have a framework to understand where the quote subject of history is, however you define that, right? You don't have a way to kind of break down the parts. And so I think it's the fact that both arrows have to be constantly, and I wasn't like, I should point out that that diagram from the abstract to the ground and the ground back up to the abstract, that's like a recurring, that was every single day, every single hour, that was constantly at the camp, were those two processes, trying to break down situations and then trying to recompose them, literally like in the sense of tying a knot for social reproduction. How do we keep the camp from falling apart? How do we keep the barrier from being kind of broken with the outside when you're dealing with police and media and agitators and things like that? Like it becomes a very real name, which is part of my another issue with Lazarus. Like a lot of things I think around the kind of more intellectual side of the left is it loses the details of the social reproduction of the political. And I don't find it, I'm just going to say, without going down this rabbit hole, that it's a lot of men that write these highly intellectual books, and then a lot of the social reproductive labor in political organizations tends to be women and femmes. So I feel like there's a much bigger political thing about social reproduction here. But I think like the long and the short of it is that it's by going back and forth between those two processes that we avoid populism per se. Hope that was somewhat satisfactory.
Just a really quick comment. I quite like your ending wherein you apply this back and forth method to our method. Like we have to just go scale up and down and see how does that apply. Like it's kind of a recursive methodology that I find it appealing anyway.
Awesome.
Great presentation. Great presentation.
Thank you. Dennis.
Yeah, it's kind of along the same lines. Like every time I hear one of your presentations, John, in particular, I always get the sense that you are like maybe more than any other member in SDP, like trying to solve the binding problem of all our different researches. just from like all the various references to the different moments in each of the other presentations, you're trying to like draw this pattern out. But I wonder like if we could tie that into the discussion on type theory and the ability to, so it's like when I listen to your presentations, I don't see it as like you're trying to break down what others are saying into smaller parts, but rather you're doing the opposite of gluing our various perspectives together, right? And this seems to correspond to this, colimit perspective, this complexifying thing, right, in the opposite direction. So the multiplicity principle says there's an obstacle to breaking things down without losing information, but then it's perfectly fine gluing things together in new ways, right? So I guess my question is really how you see that the role of types in creating that more complicated structure in a way that's like still useful for us.
So types in the actual process of binding with colimits?
Yeah. But yeah, like just focusing on the research aspect for us, like how are we binding our research together using this stuff,
Yeah. I think that in turn actually goes back to Anna's question about like where Olivia Cotamello's work is in all this, right? Because part of the, I guess, the art of the formalism, right, is finding the right colimit to bind things. And like it seems that based on her work and the idea of toposes, is what she calls like conceptual bridges, that they give us the kind of right framework to determine essentially like what is the proper structure to bind things. And the way she does that is you start with your two terms that you're trying to bind, and then you kind of find the third term coming from each direction, right? So the third term represents A and B or X and Y. And so it becomes something that can then transit between those two. So I think on the one hand, our formal resources give us the overall approach, but I think the other side is like, I don't know, because that's the art, like that's the art of it, I think, is like, that is the political, like, for example, when we ended up implementing the camp meeting that did so much to stabilize, that was a political experiment. But I think in this particular sense, that was also a kind of colimit to bind together people, or maybe not a colimit, maybe even something more at the level of like a co-regulator. Which I think that actually begins to answer, like, is another aspect to answer your question, which is like, I read something recently, it was Rosen actually, he's talking about category theory, he's talking about topology, and he said, through a long process of trial and error going well into our own century, topology finally came up with blah, blah, blah. So I think we have to remember when we read this stuff that like, it didn't come ready-made. Like mathematicians spent a lot of wasted effort trying things that didn't work to get to the things that did work. And I really just feel that the process of political experimentation is precisely testing out what colimits work. And you can go read or talk to people from other occupies and our own occupy. There are plenty of experiments that didn't work. And I think the reason ours worked was, again, because of the other side, the limit, where we really honed in on the, kind of relationship between the critique of capitalism that was latently there in Occupy, even though it wasn't always super thematized, and then its specific kind of particular instantiation in the homeless as the reserve army of labor. That gave us a way to start to test out different things. And we tried a lot of things in the 2 months of our camp, many of which were failures. And so I think that, the idea of experimental method, both in the scientific sense, but also in the artistic sense, all artists are experimenters at some level, right? Like, I think that really starts to come in really big here. And this kind of goes back to our conversation we were having a few days ago, Dennis, also just like what it ultimately means to establish a congruence, like Rosen would say, between MES and any given social system. Like last week, we were talking about police departments. Is the police department as a whole an MES? Is a particular department within that an MES? And I think the type theory is precisely what comes out of kind of establishing those congruences. As we establish the congruences, as we test them out and they hold, those are precisely the types that make sense, right? But yeah, just I think we need to remember that all these cool formalisms themselves were the product of a lot of testing, and that's, I think, you know, where we're at now. Hope that kind of punted it, but I think in a
that made sense to
honest
me.
way.
Somehow it made sense.
Anna.
Right. So trying to connect a bunch of these things, like I was really thinking about the conversation about names, and it connected to a few different things from like stuff I've been reading. I forget which Zizek book, like so many Zizek books in the 90s, like it's like all one book in my mind. But there was this one passage from one of them that was sort of about like, and I'm sure she referenced some other, like got this from somewhere else too, but this idea that, you know, when your like quote unquote enemy starts using your language, it's kind of like, in a sense, like you won like a certain kind of discursive battle, like they're like on the defensive when they're using your terms. It signifies a certain kind of balance of power discursively. And I feel like that's such an interesting insight that like I haven't seen very much sort of follow up on like what it implies, but I think about it a lot, like in terms of what kind of language people use and what it implies for like balance of power from a discursive perspective. Something else I was also thinking with respect to names and like also the sort of like, you know, irreducibility, like they can't be decomposed, is there's this concept in, so like Raul Moncayo, who's a Lacanian psychoanalyst, has this really interesting book connecting Lacan to Zen Buddhism. And one of the concepts from Zen that he takes and connects to Lacan is this idea of turning words. So like a turning word, I forget exactly the Lacanian concept he tries to line it up with, something like, you know, cathected signifier, something like that. But like the idea is sort of like, I mean, they're basically puns. Like Lacan loves wordplay, loves puns, and so does the Zen, different, you know, Zen Buddhists. His idea is basically that a lot of key insights happen not when you try to like break a word down into its parts, but actually when you like play with it, like when you sort of find some kind of like opportunity to make a pun or like wordplay, or like if it implies something else, almost like that sort of literary exercise idea, that like that way it's like you're not really reducing it, but at the same time, like you're implying some other connection that people will sort of find their own way to draw out from. And this is something that a lot of people really don't like. Like, I think this is part of the whole like Sokal, like intellectual impostures kind of a thing, because there's so much of this kind of approach to discourse in a lot of that sort of continental field. And like this idea that everything isn't actually reducible, like makes some people mad, but like is actually an effective part of our daily lives, like all the time.
Yeah, no, I think that's, and what you just said actually made me think about your earlier comment about things being more effective when they're unexplained, because I think that's that also, I think, kind of ties to Dennis's question insofar as, right, like going back to the camp experience, one of the words I put down, like I said, was listening. And that's been something I've thought a lot about over the years, because like, not just in the sense of sensing, right? Like I listen so I can get good information to make decisions, but like creating a political space within which listening is actually like a part of the political practice, and like what that does to create a kind of intersubjective politicized space for people. And I think a lot of that does have to do with exactly kind of what it seems like you're talking about, right? That there are ways that we kind of negotiate language with things like puns or things like the unsaid or the implicit that enable us to actually kind of deal with complexity that when we try to thematize things, when we try to bring it out, actually loses it, right? Like we, even natural language with all of its seamless capacity loses, right, its ability to do this. And so, you know, Maria Lugones's work touches on this a lot. She actually really emphasizes the role of playfulness and kind of like building political coalitions, that you have to go into it not in a trivial sense, but truly in like a being like not being kind of weighed down by the constraints of an oppressive society, and like realizing that these are all fundamentally like things you can play with and create and make stuff out of. And so, yeah, I think this, like, it's particularly when we're talking about sensing and then also carrying out actual experiments. Yeah, this idea that we have to almost kind of have a space of non-verbal or non-explicit to let it come out, I think is really important. Gabriel?
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually wanted to go back to the thing about Lazarus, and also just one thing that we ended up not focusing very much, but especially recalling Dennis's own presentation on types from a while back. I think the first time we started talking about types was a very specific context, which was, it was the first logical approach to the idea of resolution in scales that we found, right? So the idea that, for example, the example we were using was, well, a commodity production process might look into a certain material, like, you know, some type of wood, under a certain aspect, depending on which aspect is relevant for value preservation or value increase, right? As means of production. So we realized that there was a weird conditioning of what we called use, and a certain resolution of the use value of an object based on the kind of logic of production. And we called that a resolution, and we had we never mentioned this again, but it was a delta resolution. It was such a cool, it sounded so serious. And but anyway, and then it said, oh, okay, this is like 10,000 people already discussed this with type theory and so on. And but it was our point of connection between a couple of different things. So on the one hand, and you mentioned this today, types are great for keeping score of input-output relations, right? But we tried to force the concept when we were dealing with it back then, not so much in terms of how you keep track of inputs and outputs, but also how do you build what is an acceptable input to a system, right? So this is very relevant for us because, for example, we can imagine, like, as a mental experiment in the vacuum, if you have a social system that is based on reciprocity, and somebody comes as a bureaucrat of a state that nobody recognizes or knows it exists or gives a shit, and you try to interact with people in this classical way, you will actually be encoded in terms of, you know, yeah, you're the dominating figure asking me for a paper, but like, we're playing a game where we both need to maintain this boundary together. It's not like just institutionalized, right? So you're going to be encoded in a way that your actions are going to serve as inputs for some weird social network that is different. So social spaces, and this is connected on the Badiouian side with the concept of atom, right? A social atom would be a certain minimal type which configures, let's say, how you inform stuff into a possible input into this world, right? So when we discuss how these domains, I mean, I feel like these two or three different meanings, right, of types, or distributive approach to types, they also need to kind of coalesce into a composite intuition in our minds, which is what counts as a referent, right? And this is very clear from Badiou's side, which was always a weird idea, that he's not logics of worlds are not logics of how we name the world, but logics of how things become a referent for names. Mm-hmm. That's constructed, but it's not the same as the labels that go onto things, right? So the sort of domain constructing domains is kind of conditioned and kind of conditioning of what gets to be the input to what, right? So you can have, for example, the word enemy, and in a certain social formation where reciprocity reigns, talking about somebody as an enemy also commits you to a bunch of things. If you say you killed your enemy and it's mode A dominated society, you're committed to burying them, mourning them, and a bunch of things. If you're talking about killing your enemy in a war, a modern war, you're not committed to shit, right? There are other commitments. So it's not only the domain in the sense of what you refer to, but also all the logical networks that follow from that. Yeah. And third, it seems like it also implies something about what we call resolution, because it implies some conditions for synthesis, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not just pointing downwards analytically, but it also is constraining upwards somehow. So I feel like you mentioned all of this today, one way or another, but we haven't really touched on these ideas for a while. So I find it useful just to list these things back.
That's really good. Yeah, I think that's.
And there is a fourth thing, which I think the guy who worked on this the most amongst us was Renzo, which I would say is the fourth dimension of types, which is the concept of sameness, right? I mean, everyone I hear talking about types. And also there's a really good lecture now on Topos Institute called Cats and Types, or why cats love types, something like this, about category theory and type theory. And saying like people always don't understand why focusing so much on these things, because why should we want to know so much about what counts as the same? And types ultimately also have this problem, right? I mean, you want to know why two inputs will be ultimately kind of put in the bag of these are the same type of inputs, right? Yeah, these two noisy things, which you have ample reasons to pick them apart by being different. Like, for example, two handshakes that last between 2 to 3 seconds. Like, hey, how are you? I mean, they are okay. If you last like 5 seconds, you're a creep, right? So there is like a time resolution that makes it for a proper handshake. If it's shorter, you're rude. If it's longer, you're a creep. If you're inside that kind of thickness of time, it's just a regular handshake, and nobody's gonna give a shit if it's minimally different, right? So what counts as this indiscernible principle? It's also, I feel like, the fourth aspect of what we're dealing when we're dealing with types. And Renzo dealt a lot with this because he was trying to give us a theory of paths that count as the same, right? With his presentation on like something is itself as it moves through these other parts of a network, that is the same as it's remaining within itself, right? So I feel like these are kind of four aspects of what is, going to say, conceptually under discussion. And then when we talk about composing things, we're kind of also talking how to move all these things together into kind of more complex things. So for example, I think in the level of domains, you did a really good job with like the discussion on territories, because if you have just one state, you can imagine that its boundaries belong to it, and it's a classical thing. And then you said, well, if I compose two states, I derive the logic of nation, because now I have two territories believing their boundaries belong to themselves. So we saw a kind of composition of domains arriving at a logic that was in neither of the original domains, right?
Yeah.
I think that we don't know yet how to do the same for inputs and outputs. Like, for example, because it's just weird. Like when I think about an input, I always think as a simple thing. You know, even if you think of it in terms of boundaries also, which is something that Renzo also brought up, which is, I think it's another way of thinking about inputs and outputs, right? Like imagining you have, perhaps that's an easier way. Like the simpler way is thinking like I have some kind of box and I have an input. But then I cannot really imagine what it means to have a complex input. Like what? It's suddenly like, rather than being on and off, it's going to be on, off, or both on and off. Like, what are we talking about? But Renzo provided an alternate version, which is we can actually think of this boundary as being one of the three logics. And then, well, if you try to cross that boundary, crossing a boundary in a kind of space where all boundaries belong to the outside and an inside, crossing a boundary where it belongs only to the inside, like that might be, let's say, a better model for, you know, inputs and outputs, like different open systems, and then imagining how they can be kind of superimposed to create like new properties of what it means to cross them. So I'm not sure how we would go about that. And I think with
Yeah.
resolutions, it's also very interesting, like thinking about composing these things, because it's hard for me to find any example of what this might mean outside of like aesthetics. Because, like, for example, Caron worked with time stretching in music, and it sounds to me like something like changing a resolution and then forcing it to a logic that is not the logic of its own, like this sort of thing. But like, I'm not sure we have good examples of what complex combination of these things might be like.
Yeah, the time stretching thing, the difficulty is that you change the resolution. So, I mean, extreme time stretching.
I'll be
Like
right back.
you have
Just a second.
you have that on YouTube all the time. Like you have like the same sound object that lasts for like 3 seconds. You may make it last for like, I don't know, 1 hour. So the problem is, if you change the resolution, you change the resolution relative to the listener. And how do you get the listeners to recognize sameness and difference within the new resolution? So you have like this, you lose the reference, and you have to do something to regain the reference back if you want the structure to be recognized at a different level of resolution. I mean, that's what you mean with the aesthetics thing, right? Like there's an operation of analysis and synthesis at the same time. You have to synthesize back what you analyzed as being the same or something like that. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I think it's an interesting problem. We don't have a good kind of intuition on, like, for example, you know what it would be like. I wonder if you ever thought of doing this sort of experiment, Caron, like you time stretch a piece, but then you need to add a listening device, which is also not human. So yeah, like if then it records slowly the thing that you're playing slowly, so it ends up being this like,
like Stockhausen, Montag's Gruss is like that, like is recording in a different speed, and then he has to. It's weird, like he has to record in a different speed, and then he has to speed up the recording. Like this would change timbre in a certain sense, but it would give him like a glissando that he's not supposed to have by just having instruments playing it. So it's actually, the machine is resynthesizing the thing before it gets to us. But
what is played is like played by musicians and recorded very quickly.
You record the musician. And if I remember correctly, you record the musician with a tape very slow. No, it's the opposite. You record very quickly because you want to have like very slow results, of course. So you record quicker with the tape going faster, and then you speed it down, and then you have a second musician trying to play with the result that is the result of the original ones sped down. So it's quite weird because you have at the same time something that is the result of, I don't know, machine listening, so to speak, like the machines producing something that is supposed to be the goal. And then you have the musician trying to imitate what is actually the result of herself playing at a quicker pace and then slow down. And all these operations produce a kind of a score, something that you have to imitate.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, because what I was thinking is, it sounds like similar to that, but like what examples do we have of, when you, I mean, I think a good example of this in politics is just the use of statistics when we lose track of like structure. Mm-hmm. So, for example, political movements start to get entangled together, you get something bigger, and now you can't really talk about it anymore in terms of anarchists, communists took the street. You talk in terms of the amount of people, because you just cannot keep track anymore.
Like June 2013, yeah.
Yeah, that sort of thing. So like you can get this sort of either quantitative or even qualitative kind of breaks in political language based on the composition of things. Right? That would actually give a really good example of, like this can actually be empirically studied. I bet you can find a correlation of two types of tension with political discourse, quantitative and qualitative. Like quantitative, when like a lot of protesters take the streets. You no longer talk about their politics, don't no longer talk about who they are. You get into this kind of big mass of people, and you try to level it in this kind of, you know,
They are against the government.
they are against the government, they're whatever. But there's also the qualitative tension when like you have few people, but you simply cannot name what the hell kind of binds them all together, right? Who is together with whom? And it doesn't need to be many people, but you'll also find a similar kind of break because you don't know how to compose these things together. I think that's a good example of like, then you need to rename, like find a different way of naming things so you can actually account for it, right?
I think
So
this
I don't know.
I think this kind of comes back to the problem of like why Olivia Caramello is important in this talk, because so much of what she kind of gives to the power of toposes, of like what they're so important for is keeping track of precisely what information is lost when you move from like kind of one world to another, what are called geometric morphisms from one topos to another. Those geometric morphisms carry with them not just the objects and the arrows from one topos to another, but the kind of rules for passing along information and not passing along information. So again, I don't have great examples either, but I think our formalisms kind of can be used when we push them to keep track of this stuff. And I think you're.
Yeah, so okay, I like wrote down a bunch of things about this, but this reminds me, this came up last meeting too, but this is what Stafford Beer talks about when he talks about anastomosis. And like the idea of like, so the example that he gives is the river delta, right? And like if you're from the perspective of one drop of water in the river delta, which path is it? Like it's no longer really a matter of like individual streams, but it's the entire delta, which isn't really nominated by anything representing any individual stream. What's interesting here, though, is that he talks about in the context of what does anastomosis imply for how we deal with anastomotic problems. And he talks about every viable system has an anastomotic reticulum that it requires in order to function, that like we can't break it down. Like this is sort of basically what Rosen is talking about. It's that you can't decompose and recompose. It's just a anastomotic reticulum. It has the obscure name for a reason. And he connects this basically to like, what is the sort of regulatory variety, right? It's something that is able to preserve this. And it's like, I was thinking of this, there's this great book, First Love. This is like all this like random Lacanian shit that I read, but First Love by Siki Kant is like Phenomenology of the One or something. There's this great discussion of like Achilles and the tortoise, which is like sort of making reference to Lacan about how like that paradox, I think it was one of Zeno's, that like you can't ever directly catch up with the tortoise, that it's sort of like always like overshooting and undershooting, but like I guess technically not overshooting, but you know what I mean, like there's just never quite meets. This is sort of like, she talks about this in the context of infinity of identity, and I've kind of been thinking about that as like the terms of like regulatory variety. Beer distinguishes between algorithms and heuristics, and about things that can't be decomposed, you can't use algorithms on them directly. You use algorithms on their parts, but when you're looking at sort of the whole, you have to use heuristics, right? That you have. This is sort of where I get into like the whole regulative idea stuff. I'm like arguing for like there's something to mode D that has been bracketed off that like we should be thinking about, because it's like there's this question of like, can we develop heuristics without them being like, I guess too reductive or too destructive, but like still function somehow. A couple of other things, right? So I sort of mentioned really briefly that like all this part and whole stuff, it's very mereological. Like it feels kind of like a project of like political mereology. Like I might pursue that a little bit, maybe like working on the presentation I've been talking about with Gabrielle.
Yeah, the behavioral mereology piece by Spivak and Fong is very in the background of all this for sure.
All right, yeah, one last thing. This is like so many things, but one last thing is, I guess this is really sort of three things combined, but I was so happy when, I guess it was Gabrielle who shared it, that constructor theory piece from Quanta. Constructor theory is so interesting. A few months ago, I was sort of just like binging Quanta articles, and that was one of them that I read, and I totally forgot what it was. Like I couldn't find it when I went back to look for it, but those ideas had been like percolating in my head for a while, because also they really vibe with the Lacanian, like the real is the impossible. And like thinking of it in those terms, and also like then with my reading of Graham Priest, which by the way, this is the last thing I'm going to say. Graham Priest his book One, please read it. And I sort of talked about this on this Dulip about the presentation I might want to work on with Gabrielle. This like the way that Priest develops, his whole book One is sort of like, how is it even possible to talk about oneness? Like, what the hell is oneness, and why is it such a hard problem? And he sets out to like come up with this whole, it reminds me a lot of Being an Event, in that it has the same point of departure of like taking Plato's Parmenides at face value, that like the one is not or is contradictory, but it's almost like the inverse of Badiou's answer. Like Badiou's answer is kind of the one is not, but Priest is like, oh, the one is, but it's contradictory. And then he like develops a whole logical theory of how to account for that. And it's really, I'm still trying to assimilate like what to make of it, but I feel like it's really relevant to like the sort of mereological questions that we're dealing with in the political context too.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I read a few of his works way back when, just in terms of like a symbolic logic course, and I know he's kind of pop-up, paraconsistent, so he's definitely someone. I know that there are other sources that Thiago and Gabriel originally used other than Priest, so I think there's some interpretive questions there, but I think at this point, the more formalisms, the merrier, as long as we don't get cognitive overload. Or we manage our overload. That's probably more realistic. Dennis.
Oh yeah, I know we're at the end of the marathon, so I don't want to use up too much time, but I was just thinking, based on what we've just been discussing, an example of type theory and geometric morphisms, which is kind of very down to earth, would be if we took the ideas from temporal type theory and really formalized, basically along the lines of what Gabriel's example was with the handshake, right? If it's too quick, it's not really a proper handshake. If it's too long, it's not a proper handshake. It has to be within a certain time to be possible. I mean, temporal type theory is developed for this specific purpose of modeling temporal duration, and things are only valid within certain intervals. And this is how we can combine type theory with toposes, right? Because the whole value of a topos is to not only describe true and false in the classical sense, but to describe where things are true. Like where in some space things are true. So if this space is if the underlying space is a time, like a timeline, the natural numbers or the real numbers of the continuum, then intervals of that timeline are your open sets. Okay, so that's one part of it, is describing how your types are attached to timelines, and then the geometric morphism piece would be how to map that onto some other logic. So an example that I think is very concrete here is that, let's say you owe rent to someone. You're living on, you have a landlord, and you have a deadline for when you need to turn in that rent. So normally when you have that relationship to an individual landlord, there is a mode A part of that, which is like, if you're late by a day or a couple of days, because you have this personal relationship with the landlord, they might just say, it's fine, we're friends, I trust you, or whatever, and then they'll take you can just pay them late. But there's a mapping from that scenario to the mode B, in which that gets flattened out, right? You're either late or you're on time. So geometric morphism would be a rule for taking arrangements from mode A, arrangements that you have with your landlord, for example, and mapping that onto like a sharp distinction, like true or false. And so you have a type is late for rent in one place, and then you have a type, that same type can exist in mode B, but with different logics there, right?
Yeah, that's really good. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. All right, well, we are hitting our 3-hour mark. It's generally we do it, so I just wanted to give any space for anything else. but not hear anything. I just thank you all very much for listening and for feeding back, all that, Gabriel.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, Vitor, who was presenting next week, he just asked in the group to shift his dates around. So the idea is that he will now present instead of the 26th of September on the 10th of October. And the 2 meetings we would dedicate to the text we sent to Crisis and Critique were pushed to earlier. So next week's already on like the conjuncture analysis. And then the next one is on the more constructive side of it, but then the next 2 already, rather than the early treatment presentation that Vitor would be doing, just to let everyone know.
Cool.
Okay.
All right.
Amazing, John.
Thank you. So
Our co-limit. Co-limit, John. See you. Bye-bye.
all right, y'all. Take care.
Take care.